everybody. My name is Laura Wilson, and I'm the live music manager for the Bohemian Foundation, and also a board member for the National Independent Venue Foundation, the 501c3 partner of NEVA. Thank you for joining us today on this panel, demonstrating the value of independent venues and the academic work that is currently being done to demonstrate their importance to the communities. We have a wonderful group lined up to discuss this, so let's dig right in. I would ask everybody to just give a quick introduction of themselves, and we'll get started. Richard, would you start, please?
Hey, my name is Richard Florida. I'm author of The Rise of the Creative Class.
I'm Michael Seman. I'm an assistant professor of arts management at Colorado State University.
I'm Christian McBride, and I'm the bass player in the band.
I'm Cody Cowan, and I'm executive director of the Red River Cultural District in Austin, Texas.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of you for being here today, and thanks to NIVA and South by Southwest for having us. So let's start with the big picture. Richard, would you be able to talk about the importance of venues to cities?
Yeah. First, I want to say I'm just jealous of Christian because he made it in music and I didn't. I was supposed to be, in my mind, I was supposed to be a guitar player. And I'm a pretty good guitar player. I just wasn't Jimi Hendrix or, Eric Clapton. So I know how much it takes to make it in music because I made it pretty far as a writer and I couldn't make it in music. So look, music is my first love. It's what I'm about. It's how I identify. That's really important. And everything I've accomplished is because my dad, who worked in a factory, bought me a Gibson guitar when I was 9 years old. It gave me confidence. It gave me the ability to talk to people. It gave me the ability to think and to communicate. My life was shaped by venues. I saw my first concert. I was like 12. My dad took me to see Black Sabbath, of all things, in a Catholic school, in a public school basement in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. As soon as I could get a fake ID, people who hire me, as soon as I get a fake ID, I went to clubs all over New York City and I listened to music. And look, it took me till I was 40 to write this book called Rise of the Creative Class, when I had the courage, and I mean this the truth, I had the courage to finally speak, because people in my field about cities and city development talk about you need to give tax incentives to big businesses, or you need to build a stadium or a convention center. And I was living in Pittsburgh and I saw that stuff. And I just thought about it for more than 30 seconds one day. And I said, no, what makes a city great is, let's call it its arts and culture, or what I call this creative scene. And it's not, and I wrote about this, Michael knows this, I wrote about this in the book, The Rise of the Creative Class. I said, it's not the SOBs, the symphonies and operas and ballets. Those are cool and those are great and we need to support them. It's the street level music scene. Regardless of what kind of music that is, it's the music scene that people participate in. And we prove that. I don't know how we freaking prove that. I work with really smart people who collect really good data, but we showed that, and this was funny, we created a measure called your Bohemian quotient. Like that was your percentage of working artists, musicians, writers, people who do stuff in the arts and cultural field. And that Bohemian quotient was positively and significantly correlated with levels of innovation, levels of high technology industry, levels of college graduates, all the things cities were trying to achieve. And it outperformed all the other stuff they thought. So yeah, look, if you don't support your music venues, you don't support your city, you don't get economic growth, you don't get innovation. That's not very good. So that's how I came to that.
Thanks. For a moment there, I hadn't heard the acronym SOBs before, and I had a moment where I was like, well, that club is just fine.
I used to live in that neighborhood.
Now, of course, the global COVID pandemic has hit venues and the music industry incredibly hard. Can you speak to the importance of the work we need to do to make sure venues come back strong?
Oh, you mean that's for me? Yeah. Look, I think that, Michael is the genius on this. So I just wrote on his coattails, and he can speak more about it in a minute. He did this remarkable study of Colorado, where he looked at the effect of the pandemic on the arts and cultural creative scene. And I wrote him a note and said, Michael, we should do this for the country and I'll help out any way I can. And we got it done. He got it done. Anyway, look, we had 50% unemployment or more among artistic, performing and visual artists. Think about that. Like, we never seen 50% unemployment. We've seen mass closures of music venues. And, just do a mental exercise. Close your eyes. And imagine yourself walking down the streets of Austin or Denver or New York City, and there's no music and no live performance, no jazz clubs, no independent venues, and at night you hear no music. You don't have a city. I don't know what you have there, but you don't have a city. It seems to me that music animates a city in a way. It creates a sonic mystery, a sonic mystique, a sound that animates a city and gives it an identity. We often identify cities through their predominant music scenes. And it seems to me that's all you have to do. You know, I'm not going to really go to stores anymore. I can get that stuff on Instagram, but I will go hear live music. And I think if you want to bring back cities, you know, we're talking about that in America, we're talking about that in Europe, we're talking about that in Canada. The only way you're going to get people back is through, you know, arts, culture. And I think of all of them, you know, I love going to art galleries, but it's not that long. You can sit and look at art. It's great, but you can sit and listen to music for a long time. So I think that's what animates our city. So yeah. And I think, look, to be really honest, whenever our cities are down through history, who brings them back? It's not rich people riding in on white stallions. It's not Amazon HQ2 coming in with a headquarters. It's artists and musicians. Every time a city is laid on its back, it's artists and musicians who rebuild those cities. So look, we're going to have to do everything we can to make sure this happens. And believe it or not, I think we will.
That's great. Do you feel like, you know, is there anything else the industry as a whole needs to do to sort of fix the carnage, as it were? And, you know, how important is research with that?
Well, look, I think we got to stop this lockdown madness. And look, fortunately in the United States, we're over this nonsense. And look, it's terrible and it killed too many people. And I didn't go out for a year and I didn't go to a restaurant and I still haven't gone into a store. But it's time now to get with it and buckle up and get with it and start to get ready at least to open up. Maybe we start with outside. Maybe we start with outside smaller events, maybe not the big stadium events yet, but we got to get back. And maybe this is less for the United States. I have the city of Toronto behind me. You know, I mean, you got to figure out a way that people can be safe and listen because keeping them locked up and locked down is not good for anybody. And it's had tremendous impacts on mental health. So the time now is to open up. And look, I've said this, Michael knows this. We need a strategy for doing this, not reaction, like not constant reaction. We need an actual strategy that says, let's figure out a plan that we're going to rebuild our cities and we're going to focus on arts and culture. And I think, you know, from a point of view of cities and real estate developers, you got all those vacant storefronts. Hand them over to artists and musicians and let artists put in gallery space or musicians put in studio space. Don't leave them vacant. I mean, that's going to kill a city. So I think to open up carefully and safely, we get with that and then make sure we have incentives, if you will, for artists and musicians and culture and venues to get into those dead spaces and live in our cities.
Thanks. And I appreciate the focus on starting small because I think there's been so much focus on large sporting events, but there's so much rich culture, especially in our independent venues that are smaller gatherings. Let's switch over to Michael. Michael, you're leading the National Research Project on the value of independent venues to communities. Can you tell us some more about that project?
Sure. It's a two-tier project. As Richard had mentioned, you know, we're working on looking at what was the economic impact or just what was the carnage that we all knew was happening with the arts in terms of unemployment and lost revenues. And one thing that just kept coming up was music venues. And I had many people call and ask, you know, how many music venues do we have in Colorado? How much is my music venue generating? And it was quickly realized that there was really no answer. People didn't know. And this was something that kind of dovetailed into my research before all of this happened. I was very interested in looking at all ages DIY music venues and venues that are off the radar and such, and the value they bring. At the same time, I've also had this history of working with economic impact studies and analyzing arts and culture and the value to a region. And it quickly became apparent that, you know, now was the time that we really need in the United States to seriously think, what's the value of a venue? It's economic, but it's also cultural, social cohesion, community development. They're incubators for entrepreneurship. And luckily, the situation occurred that the Bohemian Foundation was very gracious in allowing me to basically helping me set up this sort of research. At the time, NEVA had this wonderful perspective and data that just didn't exist before nationwide. And I had this background, so it kind of all came together that we thought, this is it. You know, there's places in Australia, the UK, were kind of ahead of us with that, with looking at values of venues. You know, it's time to do this in the United States. So the first part of it is really the economic value. A venue, yes, it's a business that is putting on music, but it's also a business that attracts people to come in and spend money around the venue as well, not just inside the venue. So you have all that spending. So what I thought would be a great idea is to create a typology and look at how much spending and revenue, operating revenue, how much do the performers spend when they're in town for a venue, depending on the size. So because of NIVA's information, I could look at, say, a 250 capacity venue that's in a city the size of 250,000 people and give a rough estimate how much economic impact that venue has in that region. And I could do that for a venue of 100 capacity in New York City. So it's rather sprawling, but basically at the end of the day, if you own a music venue, you can say, okay, I'm a 600 capacity venue. I'm in Austin, Texas, and I had this amount of economic impact estimated. I look at this as the first step of the first part of the project. Once we have this framework built, this is something that could possibly be an app. This is something that could be online, much like Americans for the Arts has their arts calculator, where if you are a nonprofit art organization, you can type in some basic information, your revenues, how many people attend your events, and have a basic idea of your economic impact. And this is great when you're looking at policy and basically supporting what your value is to the community economically. That's the first part. The second part really dovetails into my research leading up to the pandemic, and that is venues are more than just places where you go see music. These are places, sometimes people refer to them as secular churches, basically a place where communities come together. And oftentimes it's the same people, more or less, once, twice a week, and these bonds build. And this helps develop community in general. Oftentimes when you have a fundraiser, where do you have it? You have it at a music venue. I know people that have been married at music venues. If there is a disaster, music venues are a space that oftentimes open up and to help people come in and help organize and get people back out. So you have that going on. At the same time, I noticed in Flint, Michigan, with Flint Local 432, a long-running all-ages venue, as well as the Cog Factory in Omaha, they were basically places that taught people how to be entrepreneurs, how to identify opportunities, locate funding, learn how to be within business, the arts and culture business. And you can draw a direct line from the Cog Factory, this totally off the radar, all ages DIY venue, directly to the Slowdown, which is this great $10.2 million urban redevelopment project. That's a venue and a theater, and also the headquarters for Saddle Creek Records. There's a direct line. These kids basically at the time learned how to be really successful entrepreneurs because they were going to this venue. So ultimately, the project is really showing city leaders, policymakers, what we all know as musicians, because we've been in venues. I've played in a band for 20 years now and have seen this time and time again. And finally, the United States is catching up to the rest of the world to realize venues are really, really important to their communities.
That's great. And I know there's another part of the study where you're going to be looking at community case studies. Why do you think it's important to look outside of the major music markets for the roles venues plan and building community? And can you talk a little bit about those communities?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's like when I talk about the creative economy in general, it's not an urban thing. It's not a rural thing. It's an entire country thing. Arts and culture are everywhere within our country. And music venues, it's very similar. You know, we talk about iconic venues, and it's usually everyone goes to New York, Apollo, CGB's, but there's iconic venues all over the country, and it's also multi-genre. You know, there's a history of venues, whether it's jazz, hip hop, rock, country. they're spread out throughout the country. And oftentimes in these smaller markets, they actually have a more outsized influence. So in the case of Omaha, that's maybe not the first place you would think of in terms of iconic venues or powerful venues, community developing venues. But sure enough, there was the Cog Factory and then Slowdown. Flint Local 432, this great all ages venue that catered to all sorts of genres and got to the point where it became 501c3. Much community development was flowing through it, entrepreneurship, people starting barbershops, tattoo parlors, restaurants that all found their social network and community network within this venue. Now they moved into a new venue, and that's the other thing too. Venues, you have to remember, they don't always completely associate with a physical space. It's not totally uncommon for a venue to move to different spaces, but continue to be the same venue. So for Flint Local 432, they moved into a newer space, and Joel Rash, the person who runs it, thought, you know what, we should have a maker space in it. And it was just a real small room, and it immediately became overran with activity. And it was one of the most successful parts of the venue. Well, they were able to get a 10,000 square foot entrepreneurial maker space for, I believe it was $1 within Flint, and it's Factory 2, and has wonderful programs for entrepreneurship, makers, and it's a huge success. So in that case, that is maybe something that might not have happened in, say, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, where space is at a premium. But here is this venue in Flint, Michigan that's doing wonderful things and has expanded and has really an outsized influence upon the community compared to maybe what it could have done in a major market.
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful point too about venues not necessarily being space, because there are so many places where there are independent promoters who are doing the same good work and not in a permanent space. So I think that's a great clarification. When do you expect to release the results of the research?
I should have the first part, the economic impact sort of typology. I'm looking to have that come out at the beginning of summer, end of spring. We're working on that right now. The community side of it, that should be sometime in the summer, and I'm thoroughly invested in this. So this is, again, connection to my work previous. So the first part will come out looking at Tulsa, Northwest Arkansas, Fort Collins. But honestly, this is something I want to go wide and big on nationally to really get the full aspect of what's going on. So it will start trickling out in the summer, but I look at this as a much bigger project.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm wondering if anyone else has any thoughts or comments from the panel on Richard or Michael's comments.
Just amazing what both of you have said. I'm taking all of this in and processing it.
Yeah, I appreciate everything y'all have said. It's interesting. I started my career like many of y'all as a musician. That didn't work out for me, and then I worked top to bottom in live music venues for my previous 20 years in this. So it's just great to see that passion for the really religious or spiritual experiences that we all have in venues reflected in both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I would love to turn it now and let's talk about what's happening on the ground with the musicians and venues and communities. So first of all, Christian, I want to congratulate you on your Grammy win this Sunday. Very well done. And I wanted to know, how important were indie venues to you as you developed your career?
Well, I am proudly a jazz artist. And when I think of what jazz means to the world, I think of it as being America's greatest contribution. I can go anywhere on this planet. It could be in Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Miles Davis is worshipped. John Coltrane is worshipped. Ella Fitzgerald is worshipped. And not because a big PR firm paid for them to be famous over there. It's because this music is so deep and it stems from a place of struggle and genius coupled together. I'm proud to call myself someone in this lineage of jazz. And you think of the greatest venues where this music was made. I mean, it's at this point, many of these places are mythical. The Village Vanguard, which is almost 80 years old. Birdland, which has had a couple of iterations through the years, but they're hanging on. You know, uh, places that have been long gone, like the Five Spot in New York. But then you have a place like Baker's Keyboard Lounge in Detroit, which is still open. You have venues in Japan and Paris and places like this. So over the last 12 months, we have seen a staggering number of these places shut down. Now, in the jazz community, we're always struggling. We're always struggling for representation on a national platform, which is why I was glad to be asked to be a part of NEVA, because usually when there's some big, if it's not jazz specific, you won't see much representation, if any, of jazz on any of these national platforms talking about the music business, independent venues, and you know, one of the famous questions that get asked all the time inside the jazz community and outside the jazz community is jazz dying? I found an old Downbeat article from 1964. The cover story was called "Is Jazz Dying?" And I can't believe that for, you know, almost 60 years now, people have been asking, is jazz dying? People like to ask, where is the next Louis Armstrong coming from? Where is the next Sonny Rollins coming from? You know, there's, these young musicians, they're doing, they're good, but they're not like the giants of the past. Well, one of the reasons that is not happening, or people think it's not happening, it is happening, but people don't think it's happening, is because we're always fighting. We're always fighting. We're always fighting for recognition. We're always fighting to keep clubs open, even before the pandemic. It's always a struggle. But now it's been tumultuous and just unprecedented for everybody, but especially the jazz community. Venues have shuttered. Countless numbers of jazz legends have died inside the last 12 years. So it was imperative for me to be a part of NEVA to help save our stages, because we need these places. They are crucial to our mental health. They're crucial to the economic health of the musicians and the venues. And frankly, it keeps this legacy, this great American legacy of jazz going. And fortunately, I've seen a lot of musicians who have gotten, because that's what we do. We get creative. We improvise. As everybody knows, that once the pandemic first started, a lot of musicians instantaneously became techies. They started setting up in their home, and they started giving live concerts at home. There have been a number of venues across the country who have been doing the same thing. They've basically been doing pay-per-view concerts from their clubs. That's good. It's kept musicians working. It's kept some semblance of revenue in their pocket and for the venues itself. But the venues have to stay open, and I really think fans have been keeping these clubs open. GoFundMe pages have been popping up for all kinds of venues over the last year. But really, I think the onus should be placed on the government, on the federal government, because I see what happens in Europe for government-sanctioned jazz orchestras. You know what I mean? You play in a band somewhere in Germany or in Norway, you are a state worker. You are taken care of by the local government, and that's what it needs to be here in America. And we create all of this great music for the world, and people view us as like what we do is sort of, it's optional. A lot of people still don't think of this being like a real job. And take us out of your life, and we'll see how real we are to you. The world needs musicians. The world needs venues for these musicians to create in. And it's a family. We all need each other, you know. Like Richard said, you know, it's like close your eyes and walk down the street and you don't see these venues. All of a sudden, people are going to realize just how important it is for music to be taken care of. This is not, you know, music is more than something that you actually see in a video or something that's tightly and highly choreographed. It's that too, but there's a much, much bigger ocean of music, of pure music that comes from here that we need. That's the DNA of America.
Thank you. And thank you. We should mention that you, you know, are certainly doing your part by being a member of NEVA's advisory board. And thank you for that. I'm wondering what you hope to accomplish in your role on that board after reopening occurs and after we've hopefully saved as many of our venues as we can.
Well, you nailed it. You know, to hopefully save as many stages as we possibly can. I actually just got it right before I came online. I got an email about another venue, which is run by my dear friend, the great bass player Matt Garrison, Shapeshifter Lab in Brooklyn. They're in trouble, you know. So I hope that what we're able to create is to be able to secure funds and support to not get those emails. You know, that's what I hope. I hope to continue to see diversity and representation. Not, you know, not just black, white, man, woman, but in terms of the styles of music that are represented in things like this. Because as I said before, jazz rarely gets a national platform. So that's why I'm here, and I hope to be able to band together my brothers and sisters in the jazz world in the midst of all of the pandemic chaos, along with our family members outside of the jazz world, to keep the boat floating.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And just curious, as an artist, you know, from your perspective, what are you seeing these days around music and community that really excites you? And on the other side of it is there anything that concerns you?
Well, like I said, being a jazz artist, the core of our artistry is improvisation. And one of the good things about playing acoustic instruments is that we can play anywhere. A saxophone player can go on the street and play. I can take my bass out on the street and people, they won't hear me well, but I can play, you know what I mean? And so I've seen musicians take to the streets and play. I mentioned earlier, a lot of musicians are giving concerts from home. That doesn't happen nearly as much as it did at the beginning of the pandemic. But, you know, musicians are going to play. We're always going to find a way to put out the healing tones, you know, analog or digital. We're going to find a way to do it. The only thing that I think if there have been any sort of concerns is that I mentioned it's been a staggering number of artists in the jazz world who have passed away in the last 12 months, to the point where, yes, if venues could open up, unless they're very, very, very strict COVID protocols, yes, people are a little nervous. You know, one of the things that I've loved doing for the last 7 years is being host of NPR's Jazz Night in America, and at the end of every year we do a in memoriam episode. Before we released our in memoriam episode, we had counted up to 56 major jazz artists who died. We could not get them all in one show. We finished the production. Inside the 5 days it took to edit the episode and air it, 3 more musicians died. And that was just the week before Christmas, you know? And so if there is some concerns, is that there are health concerns, you know. So when venues reopen, they have to have some sort of a strict protocol, because we want to play, but we don't want people getting sick and dying. We don't want that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Venues are nothing without the artists, and thanks for illuminating that. It's a really important point. Thanks, Christian. Cody, let's turn it over to you for a moment down in Austin. What are you seeing in terms of venue advocacy these days, and how are you doing that in Austin?
Yeah, so the sort of efforts that we see NIVA and NEVA working on, I think, are really exemplary of the sort of grounds level work that's been happening in local markets for the past 5 to 10 years in particular. Here in Austin, while we've certainly had advocates in music going back 30 years, about 5, 6 years ago, you probably heard Austin is one of the fastest growing cities in America. Well, with that comes the challenge of affordability, the ability of venues to be able to stay housed in their traditional spaces or find alternate spaces anywhere in city limits, and for music and musicians and music workers to be able to be housed. I mean, housing has kind of become a way to park money, and it's no longer about places, spaces, and people anymore. So we figured out pretty quickly, moving up in the Red River Cultural District, which if you've ever been to see live music in Austin, never been to South by Southwest, then you've been to the Red River Cultural District. It is in eastern downtown between 4th and 15th Street, and it's the single largest center of live music venues in Austin, Texas. But if you've been down there, then you know this is where ground zero for fun happens, but that it's also it's a challenge every day for us to get by. I think back like 15, 20 years ago, we thought, how do we address gentrification and affordability? Well, we tried to keep the street in downtown as shitty as possible, right? It's like maybe if we're gritty and punk enough, you know, like they won't come. And then really quickly we, you know, drank our coffee and woke up and like, no, that's not how economics works, and that's never gonna work. So then we realized pretty quickly then kind of the old parable that the bundle of arrows is harder to break than the single shaft. You know, like many of my peers and I started, as I alluded to earlier, in live music venues over 20 years ago at the legendary Emos. I'd known people working on the street for 20 years that I'd never sat down and had a conversation with. And there was always a sense in the venue community and in music itself, there's like high level competition. It's kind of swimming with sharks, right? So even if you're friends and you're going to have a whiskey with someone after the show, the venue next door is competition. Well, we realized that attitude might be true in terms of booking bands and getting Christian to play, but that's not true as neighbors and as a community, and that sort of force multiplier that venues, arts, and creative creates for cities, and particularly for Austin downtown. So we self-organized, put together a coalition, and then built a merchants association to manage that part of downtown as a district. Because we knew, as the late great Texas Governor Ann Richards said, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? And the city of Austin, in spite of being a music city and claiming this pretty lofty goal as being the live music capital of the world, really doesn't get live music, doesn't invest in live music, and doesn't support live music in terms of public policy or economic development. So we understood that we had to be our own agents and our own advocates if we were going to get our voices heard, and that what was true in business is also true in public service and in civic engagement, which is that math always trumps emotion, right? And I think as creatives, being really centered in the creative brain, we always thought people are going to understand the importance of culture, man. You know, it's like, no, they don't, and they don't care. And they just think you've been smoking too much, you know? So we had to get down into the nitty gritty of math, into economic impact studies, really understanding what that meant for the city, not just culturally and as a marketing nomiker, live music capital, but what does this mean actually for jobs growth, for livability, for attractive desirability for folks to move to Austin? I mean, it's pretty ironic, I think, that music has been identified as the single largest growth contributor for our city here. And yet we're kind of victims of our own success, because now we've kicked ourselves out of our own apartment. You know, it's too expensive to live here. So this sort of grassroots organizing is the key to all of it. We've also put together a coalition called Music Makes Austin, which is more of an umbrella music group that includes Music Venue Alliance Austin, which includes all the venues in Austin, EQ Austin, which is a music equity group to talk about how to actually activate diversity, equity, and inclusion inside of the music business plan. We also have Austin, Texas musicians and the Amplified Sound Coalition, which are music workers and musicians, advocacy groups, self-organized. Then of course, other industry giants like South by Southwest and C3 and some individual musicians and venue owners. So we found we all had to get together, because this is another rope-a-dope that government plays with you. If you come in saying music needs X, Y, Z, then they'll go, okay, interesting. They'll go and find another stakeholder who they'll prompt to say music means ABC. So we realized pretty quickly that if we weren't speaking with one voice, even if we had very particular interests niche to each group, that we would be used piecemeal one against the other. So I think this is the same approach that, again, has been exported into NIVA and NITO, not just from Austin, but from cities more nationally and perhaps even globally. And this is sort of the way of the future for the entire scene. I think it's really exciting for me, again, as an old punk hip hop kid. It's like the world that we emerge into after this, both as fans, guests, and as business people, it isn't contingent on anything that happened before, right? We have this window of opportunity to do everything different. I mean, again, books will need to be balanced and shifts will need to be filled, but how we approach live music, how we approach the structure of the business plan, and how we approach better equity in terms of pay for workers and musicians, but also in terms of consumer expectations for what those ticket prices and beer prices are going to be, are really totally up for grabs. And again, folks haven't rehired, so how all venues are staffed and kind of mobilized going forward, including safety, is totally up to the culture of the community and this sort of organizing activity. So I'm really excited. I think we have boom business days ahead, but the hike to that is going to be further than is probably comfortable for non-music people. And it's going to take a lot of serious conversation and hard work.
Do you see an appetite for that change that you were talking about for when we reopen in Austin or beyond?
Folks in the district are rabid for it. I think I'm really fortunate to be surrounded by peers who all get the message, right? It's like I grew up in the end of the underground music scene in the 80s and 90s, and there was some really cool stuff that isn't even worth going into here. But the sense of camaraderie and real sense of togetherness was patchwork quilt at best. There was for a lot of toxicity and a lot of just really a lot of darkness there. If we're being honest, I see some heads nodding for those of y'all who experienced that. But I really feel like there were many of us who learned the best lessons of that community, and then disposed with the cool kids club and the sort of bullying and all the violence and all of that garbage, and have just gone, this is our lives, this is our identity, this is like what is beautiful in life, and we have to do it right. It's kind of like the infusion of the counterculture into the 80s and 90s, versions of that counterculture. So I'm really excited about the future. Everyone is really jazzed up and really motivated by their idealism, actually. So I can't wait for us to be able to get back to work. I just hope we can get vaccinated enough to be able to then start putting our safety plans into place.
I hope so too. Can you speak to the role of the research and data and advocating for venues, especially recognition of the work that Michael's doing?
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say, you know, we have this kill rock star thing in the punk world where we just don't look up to anyone, and there's like there's no moment of being sort of starstruck. But so privileged to be here with Richard Florida and Michael Seman. I mean, you know, in my post rock and roll world, as a music wonk, y'all guys are the leaders and thought leaders for this entire conversation. I'm really thankful to be able to point back to y'all's work on this time and time again. There's just really an absence of data, whether it's on the macro or micro level, to be able to engage these conversations really seriously on local levels. I mean, I chair the local organizers committee at NIVA, and this is like a topic that comes up frequently. It's like, who has this economic impact study? What have Michael and Richard put out recently? You know, it's these sorts of studies. We also had a hobby school study that was put out at the beginning of the pandemic that pointed to when everyone is going, what is this, and who's going to close, and when will we be able to reopen? There was a lot of denial going on, like, oh, in a week or two from now, we'll get back to normal. And some of us who I think at least had superficial economics education were going, y'all need to. I was literally sending an infographic around of the 7 stages of grief to government in all my conversations. I just texted to them like, okay, we need to like get through denial really quick here because we need to start talking about how these folks are going to pay rent, because the business plan is like over, and those rent dollars are still rolling with their landlords. So this work, these studies are absolutely vital. I mean, you can't go to an economic development department at a city and be like, culture is important. You know, you can go there and say, we have a $2 billion economic impact. We employ, you know, a 5,000 person workforce, and we've seen 4 to 6% annual growth, you know, yearly. And we host, you know, several of the largest festivals in the world, with so on and so forth, you know, data provided by South by Southwest, by ACL. And then all of a sudden you're putting together a portfolio in a pro forma that the city just kind of leans back and doesn't know what to do with. Also, because this is niche information, really niche information, that only some of it is publicly viewable. I mean, as Michael and Richard know, you can probably get sales receipts for alcohol and beverage sales. You can get comptroller taxes to kind of tiptoe around who's employed, who's not, even though there's so much contract labor in our world. But you're not going to get up-to-date information about ticketing. You're not going to get up-to-date information about, you know, heads coming through doors, or these sort of like 12-to-1 ratios as discussed in the theater study in Chicago. I mean, these are just like, these make the conversation. And it was by virtue of these sorts of arguments and the report y'all put out this summer that my group of advocates here were able to get over $10 million for live music venues, for music workers, and for musicians in aid from CARES package and from general fund from the city of Austin. I mean, there was no plan on the city doing anything in that regard, but this hard math really set the tone and allowed us to capture for the real need here in the city.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cody. That leads me to a quick follow-up question for Richard. You mentioned that SOBs and others venues are supported by cities. Are there any other organizations or entities that you've worked with that are supporting venues and musicians and other creatives?
Local foundations. And when you're lucky enough to have a big foundation like the Walton Family Foundation in your town, or the Kaiser Family Foundation in Tulsa, you get support. When you don't have that, you don't. And I want to say something else, which might not be known. There ain't nobody out there supporting Michael's work and work in this area. Michael's doing a lot of this on his own dime. You know, I don't need to support. I'm senior enough, so I have a little. I mean, I don't have a research team, but I have it would be great if I did. But there is not a lot of support. If you think musicians are bootstrapping and DIYing, there are no research centers at Harvard or MIT or Carnegie Mellon to do this stuff, or Stanford. This is individuals DIYing this research. And people ask me all the time, is Michael going to redo his study? I'm like, maybe if I can find some money for him, he'll redo the study. Like, so I think one of the things is this has been so ignored. It's not only the musicians and the venues that are ignored. The research is a community that looks like the music community of DIY intellectuals, or whatever we call. I'm making that up. The other thing that I wanted to say is I just want to challenge some artists and musicians. We get a lot of pushback, and thank you, Cody, and thank you, Christian, for making music and arts into a statistic and taking the cultural value out of it. Look, we're both musicians. Music saved my life. I wouldn't be here talking if I wasn't going to John Cheer's Capitol Theater and going to venues. It saved my fucking life. You know, my friends who didn't have music, they died. This is no bullshit. So the reason we're making this argument about the economic value of music is not because that's the whole thing. It's because that's what policymakers listen to. They don't listen to you just saying it's good for the soul, it's good to the heart. They just glaze over. What they want to know is what Cody said. What is the economic impact? How many jobs? That's not the whole story, but that's part of getting our support. And there's one thing that's so important. When we disaggregated the whole American economy, the whole thing, and we looked at the economic sectors that add value to the American economy, people talk about meds and eds. Meds and eds, they don't add value to the US economy. They're a good thing to do. They educate people, they create some jobs. There were three sectors of the economy that add value: science and technology, business, finance and management, and arts and music. Not that they are not draining, folks. They are adding value to the economy. And Cody, you said something about Austin. Look at Sweden. Their biggest export sector in Sweden is music. So the point is, it's important that we take the economic value seriously. There is a heart and soul of music that we have, but if we don't take the economic value seriously, we're not going to make the argument we can make.
Thanks. Does anyone have any follow-up comments to that?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up with what Richard said. You know, all of us understand how a scene works, right? And it's all of the culture. It's also all the business. But if you can't retain those scenes locally, then you won't be able to export that economy, right? If cities like Austin doesn't have housing that is affordable and don't have venues in order to hone the art and then find peers and other bands to work together to really get the juice flowing, then the whole project essentially ends, right? And I couldn't agree with you further, Richard. I mean, music saved my life as well. And
yeah, I could tell.
And there are plenty of people who didn't make it as well. And I mean, this is like real life or death stuff. I mean, just talking, you pointed earlier to reopening and the impact of mental health on folks right now. And in the music community, I mean, it's like every time I open up Facebook, I'm just waiting to see my next friend's obituary.
Yeah.
If I might
I want to go back to one more thing about the need for the scene, what you said, the scene, or what Christian said about genius. You know, I've read these studies of creativity, and you know, what motivated me is the study I read when it said, if you look at the great geniuses of 20th century, it's Louis Armstrong and Jimi Hendrix and Stephen Jobs and Bill, and they're all the same. One worked in technology, one worked in music, but they are all the geniuses. But in technology studies, we talk about the ecosystem. Bill Gates or Steve Jobs came out of an ecosystem supported by venture capitalists and universities. And I studied science and technology at the Center for Science and Technology and Public Policy at Harvard. There are physicists and chemists talking about the ecosystem that produces innovation and all the little contributors who are making these tools and widgets and gadgets and working in labs. Do you know how many of us it took to produce a Louis Armstrong or a John Coltrane or a Charlie Parker or a Jay-Z or a Jimi Hendrix or whatever? It takes thousands of people in an ecosystem of which that genius emerges. All of those people are valued. All of them need support. And Cody, you said something really important about reopening the venues. Equity, focus on racial equity, class equity, gender equity, but also this idea with the Biden plan, this great plan that we have with the minimum wage, making sure that everyone who works in a venue, include the musicians on down, or whatever way you want to say it, those waitresses and waiters, and everybody's making a living wage. We have the opportunity to do that.
And to add to that, if we won't do it, if we can't do it, who the hell will?
Yep. 100%.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to ask one question to all of you before we wrap up. You know, in general, if there's one piece of advice that you could give NEVA members going forward, either regarding reopening or surviving the pandemic, or how to strengthen your community based upon your experience, what would that be? And I'll start with you, Cody.
Say you're not alone. You're not alone. And that's the message that resonates over and over again at our NEVA local organizers committee, time and time again. People show up to the first time to this conversation and they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't think I can do this. And they're drowning. And we're there to say, you're not alone.
Thanks. I think that's good advice for all of us in surviving this. Michael?
Pretty much in the same lines. What I tell my students in cultural management and creative economy is build coalitions. If you want something done in arts and culture in your community, like Richard's saying, it takes a lot of people. Build coalitions. It could be someone in real estate, a medical professional, a lawyer. Everyone loves music to some capacity. And I'm always shocked at how willing people are to help when there is an idea that you can push forward. Build that coalition, because at the end of the day, you have to convince those policymakers and city leaders that really largely talk the language of money and jobs. If you have a coalition, you will have a much better chance of getting what you want done completed.
Thank you. Christian?
I would piggyback on what has been said so far. I would also urge my my artist friends, much in the same vein as Richard was saying, all of you have been saying, read up on what's going on behind the scenes in our business. I think musicians have become much more business minded in the last couple of generations. Yes, we do speak a language of music. I don't even know how you describe it. This soul speaking language that we play through music. But as you said, the people who really are in charge of making things happen, they're not interested in that. They speak another kind of language, and a lot of artists need to learn what that language is. So I would just urge all my artist friends to continue to be business savvy.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that, Christian. And when we're speaking in that language, doesn't mean we're giving up the other language.
That's
we know
right.
the other language, and
That's
that's
right.
what we care about.
Mhm.
It's just two languages. You learn two
Yep.
languages. You speak
Yep.
one to power and one to the artistic community, and you're
That's
not
right.
cheating either one. And that's what folks have to learn. The other point I would make is I was lucky being born in Newark and then growing up in nearby North Arlington, because I could take the PATH train to New York City and experience that scene. But had I been born in another town, in a more rural town. So I think keeping a little bit of a focus on the smaller places, those smaller cities where so many kids are growing up, maybe the New Yorks and the Austins and the LAs and the Miamis can help, and the Denvers. I don't know how you do it, but there's got to be a venue in all those little small towns, but it's only one. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's the congregator. I think this, as when you say the coalition of places helping places is so important, because there's so many people that don't have the richness of the bigger cities where they can. Even in the pandemic, it's going to come back in some way, shape, or form. My worry, what keeps me up at night, is Akron and Dayton and Young.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? And the rural areas outside those places where kids are going to go without that connection that all of us got. So that's what I would say. We got to keep an eye on the small places as well as these big places that are so critical to our national and global heritage.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful final word for this panel. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and a special thank you to our panelists, Richard Florida, Michael Seman, Christian McBride, and Cody Cowan. Thanks so much for joining us today to discuss this important matter. I also want to give a thank you to NEVA, the Bohemian Foundation, George Kaiser Family Foundation, the Walton Foundation, the Music District, who's producing this for us, and South by Southwest for having us. I look forward to the outcome of the research, and also to when we can return to strengthening our communities in person in our independent venues. Thank you.